Good evening. My name is Robert Begley, and welcome to The Voice of Reason. This program can be seen on alternate Thursdays from 7 to 7:30 p.m. on Channel 34. Throughout history, there has been the sovereign mind of hero and heroine, unborrowed vision, conscious conviction, displayed and portrayed in fact and fiction. From Aristotle to Ayn Rand, Da Vinci to Montessori, Galileo to Newton, from Jefferson to Edison, from Neil Armstrong to Neil Peart. Each of these and a handful of others have demonstrated the voice of reason. The purpose of this program is to show the role of reason in human life. We'll cover a wide range of subjects, from music, dance, philosophy, poetry, to business, economics, public speaking. What are you not going to see on this program? Celebrity scandals, sermons from the Mount, astrology readings, or any portrayal of human beings as puppets. Dangling on the strings of failure, misery, self-sacrifice. You can turn the channel to just about any other program if you want to see that, but here we'll focus on that one attribute that distinguishes humans from everyone else: reason, the faculty that integrates sense perceptions by means of logic. Reason, the cause of the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of this country. Reason, the root of all scientific, medical, and economic progress. Why? Because here we believe that a little reason goes a long way. Our topic tonight is economics. My guest, Richard Salzman, is an author who has written the book Gold and Liberty. He has also been published in the Wall Street Journal, and he is the vice president of H.C. Wainwright Economics, Inc. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I just want to start off by saying that this book is a fabulous overview of the history of gold to begin with, but I just want to know, can you give us a brief idea of what would you say is a basic relationship between gold and liberty?
Between gold and liberty, really the point of the title and the reason I selected gold and liberty is to capture the economic and the political aspects of this topic. By liberty, I'm suggesting a system of laissez-faire capitalism, a system of limited government where government's sole function is to protect individual rights. Now, this book is an application of that principle to the issue of monetary affairs. So it's a history of gold, but it's also capturing the theme, I think, that if you look at human history, the use of gold as money in any era, in any part of the globe, has coincided typically with systems of liberty, systems of more limited government. On the other hand, periods in history where governments were growing, especially of this century, where you had Leviathan, basically totalitarian governments, welfare state governments, they have been enemies of gold. They have tried to eliminate gold as objective money. So that is really the theme of the book, what I try to capture in the title. Okay.
Now, you talk a lot about distinguishing free banking from central banking.
Right.
How does this tie in? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, free banking is an integral part of a gold standard. We can talk about what a gold standard is, but as to free banking, this is in distinction to central banking.
Right.
Central banking is what we have today. Central banking is a system where the government issues money. The Federal Reserve in this country, for example, has a monopoly on the issuance of money. No other bank can issue money except for penalty of counterfeiting. What this enables the government to do is have access to a banker, in effect. So that's central banking, the centralization of control of credit and money in the government's hands. That started in this country in 1913. So for the first roughly 130, 140 years of the United States history, there was no central banking system. Alternatively, there was free banking. Now, free banking is a system where private banks, like Citibank, the Bank of New York, and others, issue currency as well as checking accounts convertible into gold. That's the gold standard part of it. But we had a free banking system for most of the 19th century. It's usually considered by historians as something that must necessarily be chaotic and disruptive to business, but on the contrary, free banking has a stellar track record of delivering stable money, safe banking, and of course it financed the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. There are still semi-free banking systems today, for example, in Hong Kong. But for the most part in this century, free banking has been wiped out in favor of central banking, which basically is financing, I would say, a financer of the unlimited government we see in this century.
Okay. Tell you what, let's define what is the gold standard.
Yeah, the gold standard, you have to go to the root of what a standard is. Then I'll say why gold. We see standards in other parts of our lives. For example, there are standards of language, grammar, rules of grammar. There are standards in law. For example, the Constitution represents a standard by which other laws shall be measured, whether they protect individual rights or not. Ayn Rand, the philosopher Ayn Rand, had life as the standard in her moral code.
Ethics, right.
And what was it? It was basically a gauge or a measuring stick, a measuring rod against which actions should be gauged, laws should be gauged, language should be gauged.
You use yardstick, I think.
Yes, I use the yardstick here. That's a gauge, or a yardstick is a good way of thinking it, and it has these applications in all these other parts of our lives, so it should have an application and has in our history in the monetary parts of our lives. So what is the gold standard? It is basically a system where money is issued against a standard. Now, just to put some flesh on this, the dollar, for example, in U.S. history, the dollar as a name, as a unit of account, just like we have the franc and the pound in other countries, represented a specific weight in gold. So the dollar represented a fixed weight in gold. In the early part of U.S. history, it was 1/20th an ounce of gold. Now, if you think of that, that's an identity. And I use the analogy in the book of a yardstick, where we know that a yardstick, for example, equals 3 feet. And that can be used to measure, in the construction business or in the architectural profession, a yardstick is used to gauge or measure length. All the gold standard is using the dollar or any other unit as a measure to measure wealth. So it's the common denominator, if you will, to measure value elsewhere in the economy. So when you're buying goods and services and you're trying to put a value on that, it's enormously beneficial to have a fixed standard. You wouldn't want that standard changing every day and fluctuating, just like we wouldn't want language or the Constitution or our code of values to be fluctuating. Yet that's what we have today. We don't have a gold standard. We have a fluctuating standard.
Well, would you call it any kind of standard?
Well, it's interesting. There was an article in Fortune just this week, and the title of it was, "In Greenspan We Trust." Now, I would identify that as a standard of subjectivism. There's a standard which says the money shall be worth whatever one individual or one government bureaucrat, in this case Alan Greenspan, thinks the dollar should have in value. The gold standard is an objective standard of value, and by objective I mean it is anchored in the facts of reality. Gold has a specific property, many properties actually, that make it suitable as money. That's why over the centuries men converged naturally on gold as money, because it had these properties of divisibility, it was portable, it was permanent in value. And today we don't have that. Today we have what I would call a subjective standard, where the government arbitrarily determines what the value of money is, and it fluctuates every day. That's why we have inflation, that's why we have rising and falling prices, rising and falling interest rates. Those are characteristic of a yo-yo type, accordion type money that we have today. Very unreliable, very disruptive generally to business activity. Okay,
now you mentioned Alan Greenspan, who way back in the 60s wrote, in fact in Ayn Rand's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, he wrote an article on gold. You want to talk about, I thought that was accurate, how he described gold back then.
Yes.
Do you know why such a change came over?
Well, I would attribute it to philosophy. At one point he held to an objectivist philosophy, therefore would uphold objective standards in monetary affairs, and 30 years ago ably defended free banking and the gold standard. I would say today he is motivated primarily by pragmatism. Now, pragmatism means basically expediency, not a principled pro-individual rights philosophy, but rather a philosophy that says there are no principles and you can basically make it up as you go along. And if you read his testimony and look at his writings, he's generally of that view, and it is quite consistent actually with central banking. It would be exactly that kind of person who you'd want as a central banker. That no advocate of objective money would find a home in a central banking bureaucracy, but certainly someone of Greenspan's philosophy today would. So I would say it was a change in philosophy on his part.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about I guess we can't say Greenspan. What intellectuals would you say were opponents of the gold standard?
Well, sir, first on the positive side, the big advocates were the classical economists of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste Say. So we should at least tip our hats to the champions of the gold standard in the late 18th century. But I would say that if you were to attribute in this century the fall of gold, so to speak, as money, not because of any objective deficiency in gold, but purely the politics of it, I would attribute that largely to John Maynard Keynes, one of the most dominant economists in the first part of this century, who was an avowed enemy of gold, and by the way, the rest of his philosophy perfectly consistent with that, a big advocate of large government intervention in the economy, basically a subjectivist view of what money should be, basically the idea that money is whatever we claim it is, whatever the government says it is. And that philosophy permeated through the culture into the monetary affairs of the country to the point where the U.S. abandoned the gold standard in 1934, right around the time that Keynes was dominant in his thought. He had some very perverse theories about what gold was. He certainly did not understand the history of gold, the value of gold, the objective basis of a gold standard and gold money. But I think in this culture today, there's a growing respect, a growing appreciation again for sound money and honest money and a gold standard. Keynesianism is on the decline.
Why would you say that?
I actually would attribute it to Ayn Rand's influence. Ayn Rand began writing not so much about the economics of gold, but about the moral and objective basis of gold money in the late 50s and early 60s. And in a culture, you see 20, 30 years after a person becomes a dominant, you see the ideas, their ideas becoming dominant as well. And her ideas have, I would say, trickled into the economics profession gradually to make a defense of the gold standard today much more respectable, much more solidly anchored in a proper philosophy than it was even during the classical economist period.
Now, wasn't Keynes the one who said, in the long run, we'll all be dead, as far as...
Yes, he did, and that actually captures the epistemology underlying Keynes. Very short-range thinking. Yes. And if you think about it, the gold standard had its greatest reign in the 18th and 19th centuries, primarily in Britain and the U.S. And those were periods where men thought long range.
Planned.
There used to be 100-year railroad bonds. There was a tremendous confidence in the economy, a confidence between men and their views, their credit between men had a kind of anchor that the gold standard could provide. So Keynes' comment about in the long run we're all dead is very typical of this century. The idea that we live, hand to mouth, that we can live beyond our means, that the government can deficit spend our way into prosperity. That philosophy, that short-range, concrete-bound philosophy has just been deadly, certainly in the philosophy profession, and Keynes just mirrors that in the economics profession. I think generally that view also is coming to an end, the idea that, well, if you're bankrupt, you certainly see the end of the line of that kind of philosophy. So.
I think in Atlas Shrugged, she gave that line to one of the bureaucrats. I can't remember who, Cuffy Meigs, I think, who says, in the long run, we'll all be dead. When they're trying to plan what the railroad will be like in 2 months.
Yes.
My name is Robert Begley. You're watching The Voice of Reason. This program can be seen on alternate Thursdays from 7 to 7:30. Channel 34. We are discussing the book Golden Liberty. My guest, Richard Salzman, is the author of this book, and he's an economist with H.C. Wainwright. And speaking about investments, one of the things that I made an investment some time ago. This is a 1 solid troy ounce of fine gold, as pure as it gets. It's a South African Krugerrand. What would you say? Let's just talk about gold as an investment. How stable is that? How much of an influence is gold as far as an economy, like a stable economy as opposed to a chaotic economy?
A good question. Today we're off the gold standard, and yet people still mine gold. There's tons of gold still brought out of the earth. So people still value gold. The fact that the governments of the world have abandoned gold and said they will no longer base their money on gold. This is going back to 1971.
That's Nixon, right? Was that
Nixon went off the gold standard in 1971. So it actually is unprecedented in our history, and actually in human history, that in the last 25 years, virtually no money in the world has any direct connection to gold. Any government-issued money is not convertible into gold, and that breaks a pattern that had been in place for 200 years. So it's quite unprecedented. But how to interpret the gold price today? The gold price, of course, you can read in the newspaper today, goes up and down.
Right, $400 an ounce today.
Yes, and there's a confusion people make about that. If you see the gold price go, as it did in the 70s, from $35 an ounce to $800, if you read the headlines at the time, you'd see that interpreted as the craziness of gold. Gold is fickle, gold is controlled by the gnomes in Zurich. It was attributed to gold as being this crazy commodity.
Right.
When actually, what the gold price means is it is actually a barometer on the value of the paper money.
Right.
The purchasing power of gold, if I can explain this very simply, the purchasing power of gold itself, what that ounce of gold will actually buy, through the ages has actually been quite stable. And I'll just give you a simple example of that. An ounce of gold, I use the suit analogy. An ounce of gold in FDR's time was $35 an ounce. Bought a pretty good men's suit. If you open up a newspaper then, you could get a good men's suit for $35, believe it or not. Now, it's interesting that today, an ounce of gold still buys a fairly good men's suit, $400 an ounce, roughly. So what has changed? The ounce of gold still buys the same commodities. The price, in dollar terms, is 10 times higher. What it really means is that the paper dollar is worth 1/10 of what it used to be. The paper dollar itself has lost value.
Right.
Why? It's been managed by federal governments for 75, 80 odd years. So here's the view I would take on investments. You can expect the gold price to rise when there is confidence, when confidence is lost in a currency, when governments pursue policies either of inflation or debt buildup that cause suspicions in the market as to the value of paper money. That will always lead people to move to hard assets, to hard money, and raise the gold price. The other thing you can use in the investment world is if you see the gold price rising, it is usually a signal that inflation and interest rates generally will rise. And for these investors out there who know what higher interest rates mean in terms of bond and stock portfolios, it's a very valuable leading indicator of the state of the currency. And therefore of the financial markets generally.
Yeah, the one thing I remember about 1980 was that Jimmy Carter had the interest rates so high.
Yes.
That that was one reason I thought gold really went up.
Yes, that was a sign of crisis, a distrust of the currency, and it showed itself in higher interest rates.
Right. And one thing different from other investments, gold it's accumulated. It's not consumed.
Yes. That's a very interesting principle to remember about investing in it. Unlike any other commodity in the world, the gold that is produced is kept and accumulated. When you think about it, every other commodity, oil or the agricultural commodities, are produced and largely consumed in that year or very soon thereafter. And yet, in the case of gold, all the gold pretty much that has ever been mined in human history still exists in above ground gold stocks. And this leads to a very interesting principle.
Are we ever running out of gold?
Well, it is a depletable resource, but technological advances have made it possible for men to bring more gold out of the ground at deeper and deeper levels. But the key point is the annual increment of gold supply coming out of the mines is only a very, very small fraction of the total above ground gold stock. And that's not true of any other commodity. So and the percentage is something like 1%. So it grows very, very gradually every year. And again, that's one of the reasons why you can interpret higher gold prices, not as having anything to do with the supply of gold, which changes very glacially, but having to do with the demand for gold when paper money is not trusted. So that is a basic principle of gold.
The one reason that I bought it specifically, actually, first of all, I thought it was going to become illegal, so I quickly bought it. But the other thing is it's physical ownership, which you don't get from a stock, you don't get from practically any other kind. I mean, I guess a house you physically own, but to me that's important because possession is 9/10. that's
the ownership of gold really was illegal. Was made illegal.
FDR.
Yes, under FDR.
Illegal.
That ties back to this theme of liberty. Notice that we didn't go off the gold standard because people thought gold was a barbarous relic,
Right.
which Keynes's comment about gold being a barbarous relic. We went off gold because it was made illegal by the government. They actually jailed people who did not turn their gold in.
They confiscated it, and
they confiscated the gold and jailed people who didn't turn in gold. It wasn't made legal again until 1975. So, to the credit of certain people who worked hard to repeal that criminalization of gold ownership, you have been able to invest individually in gold for the last 20 years or so. And actually the net effect has been, over the last 20 years, that more and more of the gold in the world is owned by individuals, not by governments, not by central banks. And so increasingly, real money in the world is being held by private citizens, which is, I would say, is a good sign generally.
Right. Okay, we're discussing the book Gold and Liberty, and this is Richard's original cover, but I had my girlfriend Blanca do her own design of this, which kind of, I think, might hit home a little bit better because it has a liberty element, it has the gold element, and this little quote over here says, "In gold we trust," which I really like.
I do like that. Can I say something about that? You know,
Sure,
on
you
the
can.
coinage now, it says, "In God we trust,"
Right.
on some of the currency. And this gets back to the philosophic basis of gold. I said it was an objective standard of value, anchored in
Right.
the facts of reality, and yet at the same time judged by men as valuable money. It's very interesting that today the claim for the value of gold would either be to God, some mystical entity, which there are some people who try to defend gold on the ground that it is imbued with some kind of intrinsic mystical element, which I totally reject.
Okay.
It's not that gold has intrinsic value, it has value for us. And there are specific facts of reality surrounding gold that make it worth being valuable. But you have this alternative standard, this intrinsic standard that God gives it value, and this subjective standard that Alan Greenspan gives money value.
Right.
And we reject both of those views as improper, that the real proper basis of gold is an objective value.
Let's talk about public financing in a gold standard. Okay, how would that be done?
Well, under a strict gold standard, of course, the free banks would be operating the gold standard, not the government itself, not central banks. So the question arises, how does the government finance itself under such a system?
Right.
I would reject, I guess, the premise that the only way the government can finance itself is to own the bank or to own the money issuer. Under a proper laissez-faire system, the government is perfectly within its rights, defending its proper functions of defending individual rights, to finance itself through either borrowing or fees charged, say, on commercial transactions that are upheld in the courts. So Ayn Rand advocated that kind of financing. So it's perfectly possible for the government to finance itself. What's not possible under a gold standard, of course, is for the government to engage in basically printing press money. Because that's not the money of the realm, so to speak.
Right.
If the government's in a system where under laissez-faire gold is money, then government has to properly operate in the coin of the realm. And you see that now today, where when the government wants defense spending, they turn to the private sector, Northrop and other companies, to provide the Air Force, the planes, and the Navy, and other things like that. The government can also turn to the private system and borrow free banking money. But they certainly could not finance the gargantuan welfare state we have today. So in that sense, gold money is consistent with limited government, a government that does not spend beyond its legitimate functions.
Okay, let's just talk. We're running short on time here. I just want to tie in reason to the gold standard. We talk about reason here on this show.
Right.
And can you give a concrete example of how it reflects reason?
I would say in two ways. One, as I mentioned, it's based on a system of political liberty. And philosophically, systems of political liberty ultimately depend on a case for reason, on a case that men are rational agents who can live independently without living off their neighbors, without living off the government. If you have a pro-reason culture, you're going to have a limited government culture, and you're going to have a pro-gold standard culture. But I would say actually there's another angle of this where reason and gold play a role, and it gets back to this issue of the standard. When you think of standards in language, and standards in the Constitution, or standards in, for example, Ayn Rand's Code of Morality, life as the standard, it's an enormous epistemological time saver to be able to have a standard, and to have a yardstick to measure your values, whether legal or monetary or moral, and to be able to gauge very quickly the value of something or the disvalue of something. And to eliminate standards is to basically eliminate a primary tool of reason, that is to use a standard to guide your life. So I would tie reason into the gold standard in that fashion as well.
Yeah, good example. Okay, now let's just close on Ayn Rand. As far as you mentioned her throughout.
Yes.
In her ideas, I think the only person that I've heard of, at least, who's talking about a gold standard, which, in other words, let's look to the future.
Yes.
It seems like she's having an influence. The only person I've heard of politically is Steve Forbes.
Right.
Do you want to say something
about gold money?
Talking about the gold.
Yes, Forbes, Kemp in previous campaigns, but Forbes, I think, more consistently and certainly more in more modern terms today, is speaking about gold money. It wouldn't be the full-fledged gold standard that I would advocate, but in terms of today's culture, it is a major step back to the gold standard. We can talk in specifics about exactly how his proposal would work, but it's true that he is the only political candidate of any stature today, even speaking about honest money, gold-based dollar, once again, the term he used, making the dollar as good as gold again.
Right.
So he's a good candidate from that perspective.
Great. Okay, you've been watching The Voice of Reason. My name is Robert Begley, and this program can be seen every other Thursday from 7 to 7:30 p.m. on Channel 34. We have been discussing the book Gold and Liberty. My guest, Richard Salzman. I'd like to thank you, Richard, for being on the program.
Welcome, entirely welcome.
It's very enlightening. I definitely recommend you get this book. It's available from the American Institute for Economic Research in Western Massachusetts.
In Great Barrington, Massachusetts, right.
And you can also get it from Second Renaissance Books, I believe.
Right, in Connecticut.
Okay, so we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Good night. Good evening. My name is Robert Begley, and welcome to The Voice of Reason. This program can be seen on alternating Thursdays from 7 to 7:30 p.m. on Channel 34. Our topic tonight is politics. We'll be focusing on the ideas of Steve Forbes. My guest, Richard Salzman, is an author and economist with H.C. Wainwright's Economics, Inc., and he's also served as an informal advisor for Steve Forbes. Richard, I'd like to start off with a definition, I guess, of what is Forbes' philosophy. You want to just tell me what that is?
I would say generally, I would classify Steve Forbes, in distinction to the other candidates in the Republican field, as a classical liberal. Now, liberal not in the sense of
that's a good
modern issue
description.
liberal of big government, but classical liberal, I mean for the 19th, 18th century, 19th century, classical liberal believed in limited government, the primacy of the individual, the idea of independence instead of dependence on government or on others, a limited government type philosophy consistent with classical liberalism of John Locke and others. Now, Steve Forbes is not a philosopher himself, but you can tell, I think, from his political writings, which are voluminous in Forbes magazine over the years,
That's right, yeah.
that's the kind of tradition he comes from. Now, this is if I can go on, this is a distinction from
the other
two. I would split the Republican Party up ideologically these ways. There is this classical liberal Forbes, which there are very few of actually in the Republican Party. And then there's something called the pragmatist, I would call the pragmatist wing. This is the Bob Dole, George Bush, Nelson Rockefeller, Richard Nixon wing, which is pragmatist in the sense of being non-principled, expedient,
Right.
A chameleon-like in the sense of adopting whatever principle
Whatever
or whatever
works.
the polls say.
Right.
And of course, if
At
it
that
leads
time.
to total disaster, which it typically has in all those administrations, Bush, Nixon, and others, then when they get fed up with that, they go to the other extreme. I shouldn't say extreme. They go to the other wing
Angle.
called the religious fanatic wing of the Pat Buchanan. To some extent, Reagan brought the religionists into the party as well. So unfortunately, for too long in its history, the Republican Party has had this false choice between you either get these unprincipled pragmatists who are trying to ape the Democrats' program, just in slow motion, versus the Pat Buchanan types who want to bring us back to a case where the state and religion were together.
One entity.
It's basically theocracy. And Forbes, to me, is a breath of fresh air because he represents neither of those mistakes, but rather the Founding Fathers' position of classical liberalism, limited government, and this holds true both in his views on social issues as well as economic
right.
and foreign policy,
That's right.
whereas the others are just a hash of errors and mistakes.
Yeah, the one thing about him, he definitely wants to reduce the size of government, which Clinton said he wanted to do that, but obviously hasn't happened. You want to
Yes,
just,
Clinton's a version of somewhat actually like Dole, the pragmatist who
Yeah,
sees the country
absolutely.
moving to the right, which is true, sees the sweep of the elections in '94 where the Republicans were brought in, and announces in the State of the Union address just a month ago that the era of big government is over. Now, the era of big government is over in the sense of ideologically, we're moving in that direction, and the only question is who's the real McCoy? Now, between Clinton, Dole, Buchanan, and Forbes, if the era of big government really is over, Forbes is the only candidate really who can deliver on that promise, because all the others are advocating big government, or the status quo at least, across the board. Forbes is radical in the sense of he wanting to eliminate the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, health, not health, the HUD, which is the housing agency that Jack Kemp himself built up under his reign, and dismantle the IMF and a whole bunch of other things, which
That's
to
radical.
his credit, that is quite radical. If you think about it, if you really went back to the Founding Fathers' cabinet agencies, there's only 4 of them. State, Treasury, Justice, and what's the other? So if government's limited functions are to protect individual rights, you'd really only have a State Department, Defense,
Right.
Justice Department, Treasury, just to finance the thing.
Right.
So all these other agencies that manage or attempt to manage the economy, labor, agriculture, energy, all these in a limited government system will be wiped out. Forbes at least represents a step toward eliminating at least 4 or 5 of them. It's unfortunate, I think, in this campaign that so much, and to some degree this is his emphasis, has been placed on the tax cuts, which I think are
Right.
critical, the flat tax proposal.
Can you describe the flat tax? Because all we hear is that the flat taxes will actually raise taxes. So,
Yeah, well, just so you know what it is, a flat tax is a similar rate, in his case proposing 17%, that everybody pays. In other words, it is a rejection of the graduated income tax, which is a system where the more you make, the more
they
you
take.
tax rate you pay,
Right.
which is based on Karl Marx. Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto that we should have a graduated income tax, that this would penalize the wealthiest. And in Marx's view, the wealthiest were the parasites, the white-collar workers allegedly living off of manual labor. Therefore, if they stole their wealth, it should be stolen back in a big way by having a graduated income tax. We have had a flatter tax rate system brought in under Reagan. and the supply-siders, to their credit, you know, marginal tax rates under Jack Kennedy were 90%. And by marginal, I mean every new dollar you earned, the government took 90% of it. And those high marginal tax rates were brought down to 28% under Reagan. And Forbes is proposing that it go all the way down to 17, and had everybody pay 17%, with one exception. So I give a credit to this, to the effect that it eliminates in one fell swoop. The
complication of...
Not just the complication, but it eliminates the punitive nature of the tax system now, where the wealthiest are punished for being wealthy, which in my view is totally improper.
Absolutely.
But it does also have the virtue of eliminating, and this is a controversial point obviously in the elections and elsewhere, eliminating deductions. If you think about it now, you get a home mortgage deduction, you get a charitable deduction, you get a range of other deductions. So you pay a tax rate, but then you deduct it by those amounts. Forbes is advocating a 17% with no deductions. In many cases, what it represents is a tax cut across the board for everybody. And the question is, how do you pay for something like that? He is also advocating the shrinking of government spending. So
necessarily,
he expects,
if they're not going to be as big,
yes,
they can't spend as much.
Unlike the early supply-siders who advocated tax cuts without spending cuts, he's advocating tax cuts which would still bring in a significant amount of revenue, and also scaling back government. So the proposal does not involve generating deficits. But it's a great virtue in the sense of making the tax system fair. And justice really requires that everybody pay the same rate. There is an exception to this, of course. If you make up to $36,000, you pay no tax under Forbes's plan.
Really?
So a family of 4, for example, would get $36,000 in exemptions, they call them. And so for their, up to that level, family of 4, the rate would be 0. So in a way, it's not actually a flat tax. Up to $36,000 for a family pays 0, then it goes to 17. But still, it's enormously better than the system we have today. And let's take New York as an example. We had the New York primary today, and one of the things that D'Amato and Pataki and that whole gang was arguing against Forbes was the idea that New Yorkers would lose their tax deductions, the state and local taxes, and therefore we shouldn't have a flat tax for that reason. Their taxes are so high, in other words, in this state and in the city, that they don't want a 17% tax cut. It makes no sense whatsoever. They're so fearful, actually, of this plan, the establishment Republicans and the establishment politicians generally, that you can see why they have come out foursquare against Forbes. He is proposing in this tax plan to basically scrap the legalized corruption that goes on in the tax code. And it really takes this form. Every deduction has a pressure group behind it. The mortgage interest deduction has the Mortgage Bankers Association behind it. So they're lobbying in Congress to try to keep the deduction. And they're paying off congressmen to keep the deduction in place. Same thing with all the charities. Same thing with all these other deductions. Forbes advocates basically getting rid of that, so you can take the corruption out of the code.
Right, and bureaucracy too. That's one of his stands. That this will inevitably happen.
It would take a lot of the money out of politics. People complain about politics now being driven by lobbyists. You know, Perot ran against this.
Absolutely.
The flat tax would wipe that out in a flash. And it would end this kind of pressure group warfare where everybody's fighting in Congress for their deductions. And I would say it also does something in the name of freedom. It takes out of government's hands this micromanaging of the economy with the tax code. You know, the government really shouldn't be in the business of saying we're going to bribe you to buy a house or we're going to bribe you to give to charity. The government shouldn't be using the tax code to manipulate our human behavior. They should just raise the minimal amount of money needed to support proper government functions, and beyond that, be out of it. That's really what Forbes is advocating, and I think the reason you see the establishment against this is they line their pockets with the lobbying money that comes from preserving deductions.
Okay, let's talk about the Social Security. Now, he wants to privatize that.
Yes, it's very rarely mentioned, these other proposals he has, which I think are very nicely integrated with the flat tax.
Tell me why they're rarely mentioned. Then
part of it is he speaks himself most about the flat tax. But also, I think some of these other issues are simply too complicated for sound bites. So I'll try to do it in just 2 sound bites instead of 1 sound bite. The Social Security system, he advocates privatizing. Now, the Social Security system is a massive fraud. There really is no trust fund to speak of. The government has taken in our contributions to Social Security and spent them. So if any private insurer did that, they'd be in jail for fraud long ago. But nevertheless, that's the Social Security system. He is one of the few politicians who has stepped up to say, let's put an end to that system, not by just putting widows and orphans out on the street, but by cutting it off at age 50 and saying that those above 50 get paid the Social Security payments that they counted on, that the government promised them, but to start a new private system for people under 50. So the people under 50 today, which pay, people typically pay 15% of their payroll into the Social Security system. Part of that would go to your own individual retirement account invested in the stock market. Now that's how private pension systems should work, and you should have that freedom. And Forbes has tremendous support actually among young people who realize the Social Security system will never be there for them. So this move toward privatizing the pension system and getting the government out of it, in Forbes's plan, the government would be out of it in 20 or 30 years or so, gradually. That's a very sound proposal. You'd get money back into the private economy, and you'd get people controlling their own future pensions and not relying on Uncle Sam in their older years.
Which you could say in reverse kind of pushes people towards independence, because now you have to think about your future.
Very much so. And care about the state of the economy. I mean, if you think about it today, the government takes your money and spends it, and then you hope to lobby the government later to jack up your Social Security payments. Imagine a system where it's totally private. Your pension money, you couldn't have, in other words, Bob Dole and Buchanan running around bashing corporate profits and bashing companies, because they're the ones your pension's invested in. Well, today, your pension, as far as Social Security goes, is invested in nothing. And you have no stake, really, in the future. And it's really a high crime of major proportions to rob people of security. It's really a social insecurity system on a massive scale, and Forbes is courageous for putting up a proposal to get rid of that gradually.
Okay, my name is Robert Begley. You're watching The Voice of Reason. This program can be seen on alternate Thursdays from 7 to 7:30 p.m. If you have comments, you can write to us at P.O. Box 1978, New York, New York 10009. My guest is Richard Salzman. He's an economist, and he has helped Forbes. He served as an informal advisor for him. We're talking about Steve Forbes, who I have to admit is the first politician I've been happy about ever, because I kind of followed my father's footsteps in voting against from day one. But he's someone that I voted for today. And let's just talk. There are a lot of issues that don't get publicity, but one thing I really like is his stand on environmentalism. He really talks about technology, which no environmentalists really talk about. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, at a basic level, the biggest misconception, I think, in the environmental debate is this view that the environmentalists want clean air and clean water, and the capitalists want dirty air and dirty water. That's a major fallacy. A good part of the environmental movement, I would say the root element of the environmental movement, is not for clean air and clean water, but is anti-technology at its very root. It's anti-capitalist, it's anti-business, it's anti-technology, it's anti-development. So the environmentalists, the environmentalists generally are, in many cases, old-line socialists who are just anti-industrial. Forbes, and to his credit, Forbes magazine has generally exposed the environmental movement for what it is. It's pseudoscience, it's anti-industrial, it's anti-technology. And from his own positions, you can see that he's very pro-entrepreneur, pro-capitalism, pro-industrialism. Forbes magazine makes a point of celebrating business achievement and applauding it instead of condemning it, as Buchanan and Dole do. And on environmentalism, very principled stands that say, listen, we want clean air and clean water, but the system that delivers that is a system of property rights, a system of objective law, not a system where the EPA is running amok, violating individual rights and violating property rights. So to his credit, he has good views on environmentalism as well, and a big advocate of technology and the benefits that come from technology.
Now let's talk about one issue that he's a little bit mixed on. That's abortion. Not that he's mixed, but he's got conflicting views, I think.
Yes, a consistent individual rights position would be pro-choice. I would even reject the concept of
It
pro-life.
would actually be pro-life.
It's pro-life, yes. It's truly pro-life, the life of the woman who has proper control over her own body. That would be the consistent Republican position. Pro-choice on everything. Pro-choice in economic affairs and pro-choice on social affairs. And none of the Republicans offer that other than Forbes. Now, I read Forbes as being pro-choice. He is against Buchanan's view, for example, that there should be a constitutional amendment banning abortions. And his general view, I think, is a proper one in today's context of being against abortion as a birth control method, just from the standpoint it is not necessarily the most rational way a woman should control her birth choices, but at the same time not wanting to make it a political issue, and that's perfectly proper. The government should not be in the business of criminalizing abortion. And so I think Forbes is on the right side of the issue there. He got some heat for it, but I give him credit for being quite courageous in standing up against the Christian Coalition prior to the Iowa primaries. Here's the Iowa primaries where the Christian Coalition, it must be 40% of the participants in that poll. And they went out all out attacking him prior to that primary, and he stood his ground and basically said, I'm not going to resort to throwing doctors and women in jail for this. So I think I think I see him
because
as
they're going to do it anyway, whether it's legal
I see
or
him
not.
as reluctant to want to alienate some of the anti-abortionists, but I see him as very pro-choice, and that's a good thing for the Republican Party. There is a growing movement, by the way, within the Republican Party of women and men in the Republican Party who are pro-choice. Bill Weld in Massachusetts is that way, and others. Christine Todd Whitman, governor of New Jersey. I think that's a very healthy development in the Republican Party. And the Republican Party should do everything in its power to root out not only the Bob Dole pragmatist types, but especially these theocrat, Pat Buchanan types, who would bring us theocracy again and bring back the integration of state and church. I see Forbes as believing in the separation of church and state, which is the proper pro-Founding Fathers view of the Constitution.
Okay, let's see. Something kind of similar to that is censorship.
Yes. He has been the subject of attempts to censor. Anyone who reads the New York Times recently has to be appalled at the positions taken by the New York Times to shut down Forbes's free speech on the grounds that he's wealthy. The New York Times has actually come out against a Supreme Court decision in 1976 which upheld a candidate's right to spend as much money on his own campaign as he wishes. And they upheld that by reference to the First Amendment right to free speech. Now here's the New York Times, living in a country benefiting by the First Amendment. They should be, if anyone, the first ones to defend the First Amendment, and yet they are coming out foursquare against Steve Forbes' free speech rights on the fraudulent ground that money somehow stacks the debate and permits you to have a bigger voice than somebody else. The Founding Fathers did not say free speech is permitted to those who are poor, but not to those who have resources. Certainly the New York Times itself has resources in the millions. I mean, they invalidate their own argument. They are a wealthy publication that you would not want to suspend their First Amendment rights simply because they're wealthy. It's not, in Forbes' case, it is not money that has made him successful and gotten his poll and ratings up, but rather his message. And I think the media, including the New York Times, are very reluctant to concede any ground that his ideas are actually being embraced. But they did the same thing with Reagan. They wanted to dismiss him as a third-rate actor and claim that it only had to do with his charm and communication skills. When it actually, if you look at the sweep of things in the last 15 or 20 years, the ideas that the supply-siders and the Reaganites and the Forbes types have been advocating have appeal among Americans generally. And so they're on the right side generally of the issues that the American people care about.
Yeah, the one thing that did bother me, though, about Forbes early on was the negative campaigns, the negative commercials, and I thought that what he's saying when he gets a chance to say it, which he should in his own commercials, is true, and this is what majority of Americans would go for. But it almost seemed like every time it was attacking mostly Dole. What do you think? Do you think that was a good idea? And if
No,
not,
I don't think it was a good idea, but I also do not have this sort of animosity toward negative advertising that the media seems to have. I think it's actually informative to be able to point out to people that Bob Dole has a history of being the tax collector for the welfare state. But what you have to do as a candidate who is a new face is you have to primarily present your positive case. So in that case, it may have been a mistake for Forbes to focus on the errors of Bob Dole, which are legion and anybody can point to,
Right.
and instead define himself. What we had to know is what Steve Forbes stood for. And to his credit, soon after Iowa, he changed the campaign to entirely presenting
Right.
what his positive
Right.
cases, which is the proper
And
thing. You
his-
really shouldn't give much credence to
That's
what
what
not
I meant,
true,
exactly,
to
yeah.
errors and what is not true. The greater credence and the greater power lies in the positive
value.
vision, yeah, that he definitely has for the country, which Bob Dole does not have at all.
Right. Okay, now let's talk about education. You said that
Yes.
would he privatize it as such? or-
He advocates, at this stage, he advocates abolishing the federal government's role in education. That's a good thing. Carter
Right.
started the Department of Education in 1977. So he'd advocate eliminating that cabinet agency and getting federal government out of the business it's now engaged in of writing standards for textbooks and things like that. A very high level kind of censorship
Talk
going
about
on
censorship
from Washington.
right there, I know.
And he's an advocate, he calls it a parental control of schools. Now this is an attempt to have parents have greater control over public schools and also have a kind of voucher system where they're able to take monies that would otherwise go to public schools and spend on private schools. So again, it's in that vein of Social Security of moving toward a more private system. It's not a full-fledged private system that I would advocate, but recognizing the political realities, it's going in the right direction
Right.
of fully private
Right.
education. I should also add that he does the same thing on Medicare. If you think about it, these are big gargantuan programs in the welfare state. If you were going to cut the welfare state in a major way,
That's the way
you'd
you
focus on
start.
Social Security, Medicare, and then this educational establishment, which is gargantuan. And in the case of Medicare, he advocates medical savings accounts, which are sort of like IRAs only for medical expenditures,
Right.
which if fully implemented, and it's, by the way, it's used in Forbes magazine, if medical savings...
By Forbes employees,
By
right?
employees
That's
there, right. It increases the freedom you have to choose your health care, the doctors you choose, and else, without scrimping on the coverage. And the main thing is it offers an opportunity to get rid of Medicare longer term, to
Right.
again, to give
To
more,
phase it
to
out, in
permit
effect.
people to be more independent in their health choices and not rely on the government to make their health care choices or rely on Hillary Clinton to make their health care choices for them. So there's another very pro-individual. You can see that all the policy positions across the board are in the direction of greater individual autonomy from government,
Right.
which I think is what voters are mostly looking for.
Okay, well, we don't know how he's going to do. So suppose he's out of the picture even by the time this program airs. Would you think that it's too early for someone like him, that the culture's not ready? You think that might have something to do with it, or should he have changed something?
That's hard to say. I would attribute part of his inability to pick up delegates to this tremendous control over the party apparatus that the existing incumbents have. If you think of it, the ones who have backed Forbes are all former senators. Kemp, Gordon Humphrey, and
Right.
others are all former. The ones that are in the system are very fearful of not backing Bob Dole, because
Right.
either way, Dole's going to be in the government. He's either going to be the Senate Majority
Right.
Leader or he's going to be the
Right.
new president. And
Right.
if you don't get on his side now, you're going to be hurt either way. So in that sense,
Talk about pressure.
I wouldn't say that his ideas are too early, but he as a candidate who was seen as an outsider really within the Republican establishment makes it very difficult for him to get the kind of campaign support and party support that would be necessary to carry the way. But I would say if ideas matter, and I believe they do, I believe ultimately ideas are what drive political parties and political campaigns.
Right.
And I believe the American people are smart enough and have a pro-capitalist sense of life sufficient enough that when those kind of ideas get out, that they'll be embraced. It may take a while. The Republicans may have to shoot themselves in the foot
a
yet
few
again with
times.
another George Bush-type candidate by putting up Dole, and that would be a crime. But the main thing is to watch in these various issues gold-based money, private insurance, private savings accounts, private education, to observe which candidates hew to that standard and which candidates are advocating that direction. That would be the thing to look for.
And just one more thing. Do you think that he might run again if he's not successful this time
It's hard to
around?
say. This campaign was entirely financed by his own money, as you know.
Actually, I made a contribution.
You did too, yes, I did too.
That he doubled
but
or backed.
he took no taxpayer money, and it's really hard to say. I'm not giving up on him this year in the sense of him being a very strong candidate still this year, and he is making promises of going all the way to the convention with his ideas. Now, we won't bring as many delegates to the convention as Dole will, but in that sense, I think he, and certainly candidates like Steve Forbes, are the wave of the future in the Republican Party, if the Republican Party is going to have a future. If they throw out Steve Forbes type candidates, I think the Republican Party is lost forever. They're either in the theocracy of Pat Buchanan or in the Me Tooism, pragmatism of Dole, simply aping Bill Clinton. In that case, you might as well not have a Republican Party. So I would put it that way. If there's going to be a future to that party, it has to be a Steve Forbes type candidate.
Yeah, let's hope he sticks it out. I certainly do. Okay, my name is Robert Begley. You've been watching The Voice of Reason. My guest, Richard Salzman, author and informal assistant consultant for Forbes, particularly on the gold standard, which we spoke about in the past. If you have comments, you can write to us at P.O. Box 1978, New York, New York, 10009. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Good night.